So I want to turn now to Sarah's presentation. Let me bring it up here for you. And I'll just quickly introduce Sarah. She serves within the Cross-Sectoral Programs Division in the Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at USAID. She's coordinating support to the agency's Applied Political Economy Analysis practice. Beginning in 2015, she's contributed to political economy efforts across a broad range of sectors and regions, including maternal mortality rates in Indonesia, biodiversity preservation in DR Congo and Tanzania, domestic resource mobilization in Liberia, and improved labor conditions in the garment industry in Bangladesh. Prior to joining the DRG Center, she served with the Africa Bureau, working first as the desk officer in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and then in the Bureau's program office, focusing on the agency's nascent African Union program. And prior to the Africa Bureau, she worked on donor coordination within the former Bureau for Policy and Program Coordination. So, Sarah, welcome.
So thank you so much for being here, and Shamika, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really great to be learning from all of you. I was sort of ticking a bunch of things off as I was listening to your presentation. We pride ourselves on being adaptive, so we'll see how well I do as I go through this. But there's definitely a lot of overlap in the way that we're all thinking. So I think really this is picking up a lot of what Shamika was talking about. That we are not looking at this in terms of creating a report. We talk a lot about thinking and working politically as the goal of where we want to get to. So thinking politically is what we're going to be talking about mostly, because it is about building this understanding of all of these political, economic, social forces that are guiding incentives. And then working politically is taking those things into account in terms of what we do and tracking them over time to see what changes. I think of PEA as kind of a formalized immersion exercise in thinking politically, which is sometimes necessary and not always necessary. And it depends both on the context and how well it's understood, and how naturally some of these questions and some of these approaches come to the people that you're working with. So again, we think of this very much as a complement to technical analysis, here being some of the questions that you would ask in technical analysis, the things that you would look at and what you would imagine being important to understand. And adding these things to this is understanding what that context is, who will win and who will lose from different kinds of approaches, as well as from the current approach. Mapping the risks and assumptions that you're looking at, and thinking about how those things actually work together to come to another sort of buzz phrase that we talk about, which is technically sound, politically savvy. So this is our framework, and this has been, you have this in different form on the last page, but this is something that we developed, I think beginning 2013, 2014. We drew, we benefited in terms of a little bit of our history. USAID came a little bit late to this game. We'd done some political economy work in the early 1990s, saw very little of it for quite a while. Those aspects of it were subsumed within other types of assessments. And then, in the last 6 years or so, there was a sense that we needed to have better tools for understanding the governance and political constraints in other sectors. And so we set to work in developing this approach and brought in a woman named Diana Kamek, who did a lot of work in Malawi and did a lot of work for DFID and other donors, and who brought with her all of her baggage from her work with all other donors to try to help us in designing a new approach. And in specifically thinking about how do we get something that's not just a good piece of analysis, but is something that will actually influence programming. And as I think about this framework as a way of stepping back and kind of trying to manage your biases. That on one hand, and there are all sorts of different biases that we all come to a situation with, that there are different ways that we can look at something. That on one hand, we have a status quo bias. We assume that there are various ways and traditions that things have been done, and that they will always continue to be done that way. And certainly that matters, and that's true, but it's not always the case. And on the other hand, sometimes we have a bias that what's happening now is the most important thing ever. New leadership has been elected, and everything is going to change. We have, new governance in an institution, and this has been the silver bullet that we've been waiting for. In reality, neither of these things are true. It's a complex interplay of these factors working together. And so this is sort of a systematic process for guiding you through thinking through those most static factors in the context through the most dynamic, bring them together, bringing together sort of thinking about what a theory might be about how this will impact change in the future, and then considering what the implications are for that. So everything begins, and we spend a lot of time when we're working with missions and programs on clarifying a purpose. Often this is determining the purpose and the key question is one of the more challenging things, understanding what it is that really matters to them and what it is that they can realistically learn within what we're trying to do is a relatively discrete analytical exercise. The foundational factors, and we'll draw them through. Given that problem, what are sort of the most significant and foundational underlying issues related to a context? So these may be things like the history, the structure of the economy, when you're looking at agriculture, just the climate and what is growing. And then think about how those things may be impacting. The rules of the game. We think about this in terms of understanding both the formal rules and the informal norms that are operating in a context. I like to use the example of monopoly because it's a case where you have both formal rules that have been written down, which many people have not read. And you have a lot of other things that people have brought to the table which were never written down, and that those things can be fluid and changing over time. So in the same way, we like to look at the context and think about, okay, how are things working? What are the rules that actually govern behavior? And then, complementary to that, what are the rules that are written down? Where are the differences between those, and kind of what explains that? And the here and now. This is sort of the most immediate things: the natural disasters, the changes in leadership, the political context issues that sort of blow up that you weren't expecting. And then we bring all of these things together. And here are just kind of a few contexts that we've encountered. I think these are where you'll see, you know that things are changing. You don't necessarily know the direction that they're going. So in the dynamic section, we're trying to look forward. We're trying to say, given all of these factors in society, from those most foundational to the most dynamic, to the most immediate, where might change possibly come from? And a really important thing that we try to do, which we find extremely hard when working with USAID staff, is to say, where will change come, assuming you're irrelevant, which is not that far from the truth. Where will change come from without you? So where is change coming from organically within the context? And then once you figure that out, how can you lean into this change a little bit, or lean into the changes that you'd like to see in order to support an approach that will be more locally grounded, more supportive of self-reliance in our current terminology, and ultimately be sustained. So here are a few sort of dynamic contexts that we've encountered. These are girls in Malawi who are protesting against child marriage. I think youth in Nigeria, just active and obviously part of a very strong cohort. Bangladesh, when we were having a conversation and doing one of our workshops in Bangladesh and talking about dynamics, one of the FSNs said, one of the things I've noticed in terms of dynamic is lately I've seen girls riding bicycles. And I never saw girls riding bicycles before. We don't know what that means, but it seems to be an indication of something that's changing in the context. And then taking all of that and and thinking about, okay, where might that change come from? How are we placed as a donor to be supportive of it, considering our own role in the political economy of a context, which may be supportive. There may be a context that welcomes U.S. government involvement, or it may not. And so thinking about, given all of those things, how do we think about what we do next? This, I think, also levels of PEA is something that we've been playing with a lot, and I'll talk about a little more as we go into a couple of very brief examples. But we've seen country level, we've had experience with country level, sector level, and problem issue level, and definitely have been most comfortable focusing on sort of the sector or the problem issue in terms of our ability to get to new information, to information that seems actionable, though those country level factors are always relevant, they're always impacting. So just a kind of very broad overview. My approach today is to try to pique your curiosity, and I'm always happy to talk about things more. These are just some of the contexts where we've been involved over the last several years. We've had, and I should say at the outset, we've had relatively limited involvement with agriculture as such. We've had a lot of natural resource management focused on biodiversity, but also to some extent with fisheries and other things. Most of that has been in Africa. We've had fisheries work in Senegal and Madagascar. I'll talk about Madagascar in a moment, as well as other natural resource management elsewhere in Africa. We've had kind of a cluster around health issues, HIV in South Africa, maternal mortality, Indonesia, tuberculosis, as well as some other governance issues that we've seen over time. Education in Senegal was another. So just kind of talking briefly about a couple of cases. And one of them, this first one will be focused more at kind of the community level, at the local dynamics. And the next will focus more on broader policy dynamics. But in Madagascar, we were working with the mission in the course of one of their designs and trying to understand the incentives and constraints related to sustainable and effective management of marine resources, and how communities could manage aquaculture and how we could support its development in the most effective way, both for their livelihoods now, livelihood and food security now, as well as sustainability into the future. And so some of the things that they tried to understand were what were the really local dynamics that were happening, and what happened as we tried to introduce and promote more valuable aquaculture products. So one of the examples, and learning as I was looking into this, that that sea cucumbers are a particularly valuable product. But one of the problems that they saw was that when they introduced sea cucumbers, it became an incentive for local criminal activity. So communities learned that if they introduced these things and there was not adequate security to provide for them, they were likely to be attracting theft, and ultimately this was a problem that they had to deal with. So as they looked forward to their design, they thought about, okay, how could they bring together coalitions to support greater security for these crops, for these marine resources, as they were looking to introduce more valuable products. Tanzania was something that I was involved in 2016. They were looking forward to another round of allocation of hunting concessions around the country. And what had happened in previous years was that hunting concessions had been allocated with very little reference to sustainable use of the natural resources. And so we're trying to understand what were the dynamics, given Tanzania's dependence on its natural resource base for its economy, and given the threat that unsustainable hunting practices were playing to this resource base. What were the factors that were influencing the hunting concession allocation process? and how could we influence that process in order to promote an allocation that was more consistent with sustainable natural resource management. We were involved there at a very dynamic time. Magufuli had just assumed office. There was a lot of focus on corruption issues, and there was a lot of questions about how this was going to impact the direction going forward. And at the same time, there was a lot of attention to hunting and some of the more egregious hunting practices. Does anybody remember Cecil the lion? Yeah, so Cecil the lion, who was lured out of a protected area in Zimbabwe and shot by a dentist from Minnesota, whose life was never the same again. And so, yes, so yeah, Cecil, yeah. And so similarly, dentists from other parts of the world were thinking twice about going hunting in Africa. And so hunting operators were trying to say, okay, they were feeling, they were feeling the pinch of this. And you saw hunting operators of all different types of, all different orientations, including many who had worked in the context for a very long time, felt very, recognized their dependence on the sustainability of these resources, wanted to be working in this for generations to come, and were willing to think about what could we do within this context that will potentially promote more sustainability overall. And so we thought about that, and then we kind of mapped the actors and thought about what their powers were in the context, and what their incentives might be, and thought about how this might be used in terms of putting together coalitions to support different types of changes. Now, a caution with this. At the time, as I said, Magufuli had just assumed power. Everywhere we went, when we asked, okay, who do you need to convince in order to see changes in this? Everybody said the president. And the president at that time, when we mapped the actors, was right in the middle in terms of their orientation to reform, and right at the top in terms of influence. And there was hope at the time that as he was looking at corruption in different sectors, perhaps this would be an area that would get his attention at some point as well. And so that was a dynamic that we were looking for. That didn't work out so well. And at the same time, another sort of caution. This is a case where we scoped it very, very narrowly, and I think it worked beautifully in terms of the analysis itself, in terms of kind of coming up with sort of concrete ideas and actions. However, we also came to a place with it that ultimately this whole area became too political for us to work with. And so in the end, while we had some concrete ideas about going forward, we were not, it was not something that was ultimately acted upon. So again, just a little sort of, as I'm closing, we like to use this cartoon as kind of our notion of thinking and working politically and what it means to program with PEA. Understanding that you're never going to have all the answers at the outset, that likely there's going to be a winding road that you pass, but hopefully, ultimately, it doesn't lead you off a cliff, which is as much as I'm hoping for at this point. And just sort of our closing, sort of a mantra that we use within our practice is that ultimately we're trying to learn to be curious and not judgmental, which is often a little bit hard for development actors. With the idea that understanding the context best will help us to figure out how best to work within it. And so thank you. And